Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kristen Bantz. I am the program coordinator for the Friends of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. Tonight, we are going to be joined by Kevin Campion of Save the North Pacific Right Whale for a presentation and a screening of some clips from an upcoming film, Right Over the Edge, about the North Pacific Right Whale. Before we dive into Kevin's presentation, I'm going to share with you a little bit about Cape Falcon Marine Reserve and the Oregon Marine Reserve System. So Oregon has 5 marine reserves. Cape Falcon Marine Reserve is the northernmost reserve. The goals of the Marine Reserve System are determined by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who oversees their management. These goals are conservation of habitat and biodiversity, scientific research and evaluation through formal processes, as well as data collected through community science programs, and avoiding significant economic impact to coastal users. Cape Falcon Marine Reserve was founded 6 years ago. Our birthday was January 1st of this year, so 6 years ago. Restrictions at the reserve began around 2016, and those restrictions refer to designations that we have within this area. So each marine reserve has 2 different designations. A marine reserve designation, which means that there is no take of anything living. So no mammals, no birds, no invertebrates or fish, seaweed, everything has to stay in the water. In addition to that, there is no activity, like no building activity that's allowed in that space. The second designation is Marine Protected Area, and generally speaking, each marine reserve has 2 marine protected areas that are either bookending the space or abutting it in some fashion. Cape Falcon has a shoreside marine protected area and a marine protected area known as the West Marine Protected Area deeper in our waters. In these spaces, there is some take allowed. So there's some fishing allowed from the shore side via angling, and also in the West MPA, you can take salmon by troll, and you can also do crabbing. The reserve and the marine protected areas are located between Cannon Beach and Manzanita on the north coast, and all in total, we have around 20 square miles that is protected. The Friends of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve is a constellation of nonprofit environmental organizations that supports the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in their efforts to provide outreach to folks about the marine reserves. So our job is to educate and engage coastal locals and visitors in ocean conservation and stewardship projects, and also get people aware of the research that's happening in the marine reserves. And we often do that through community science projects. On your screen now, you can see a list of the organizations that make up our main partners for the Friends of Cape Falcon. Now, we work with individual organizations outside of this network as well. I should mention that the Lower Nehalem Community Trust is our fiscal sponsor. But for tonight, we are working with Kevin Campion, and he runs the Youth Voyaging and Conservation Organization Deep Green Wilderness and has newly founded Save the North Pacific Right Whale. Kevin has produced another film called The Unknown Sea and is president of the board for the Sea Dock Society. And tonight, Kevin is going to share with us a little bit about the North Pacific Right Whale through a presentation, and we get to see clips from his up-and-coming film, Right Over the Edge.
Okay, so yeah, first I want to thank Kristen and all the folks from the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. The place, if you've been to Cape Falcon, then you know. If you haven't been, then go check it out. It is a critically special place, worthy of every protection that it can ever earn. And I am just like so thankful for the foresight of folks that have started the process, got it protected. Super cool now that it is connected to the park and now connected to the Rainforest Reserve. So tip of the hat to the folks at the North Coast Land Conservancy for getting that work done. Just a very special part of the world, and yeah, I can't say enough good stuff about the work that's happened there. Thank you all for tuning in and giving up your Thursday night to learn about the world's rarest whale, which is a tongue twister that I'm getting unfortunately good at saying. But yeah, thanks for taking your time. You know, there's a lot of other things you guys could be doing, and so it means a lot to me and the rest of the folks that Save the North Pacific Right Whale that you guys have all taken the time to learn about North Pacific right whales. So just a quick bit about myself, and just I'm going to show the PowerPoint to learn a bit about right whales and some history, and then we are very close to being done with this film that I've been working on for years. Let's see if I can move to the middle of the screen here. Been working on for the last 5 years, and after the PowerPoint, I'll show you guys a few clips from the film. And yeah, I have 2 computer screens going, so just bear with me with any sort of technology. If something seems really wonky or something, feel free to just unmute and let me know. Don't worry about interrupting. And then if people have questions, we can put them in the chat, and then maybe Kristen or I will go through and we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So kind of the nuts and bolts of the thing. And here we go. So when I am not doing my job at Save the North Pacific Right Whale, which is a pretty new thing. For the last 12 years or so, I've been running this organization called Deep Green Wilderness, and we're a sailboat-based education program taking teens voyaging for up to 3 weeks, usually in the San Juans and up into British Columbia, teaching them about whale conservation, navigation, how to sail, and whale research, and how all that stuff kind of intersects to result in making changes for whales and for their ecosystem. And so we have 2 programs we're running this summer. If you know a teenager that sounds like they would like to learn more about whales or wants to learn how to learn how to sail, send them our way. We just opened up the applications. That's at deepgreenwilderness.com. We got a robust scholarship program that we're super proud of. So if you know someone that you think would be interested, send them our way. We've had a couple of students from Manzanita. I think one of them might be signed in tonight. And just speaking of signed in, quick hello to, I have a lot of shipmates. I saw their names come up out there. So super cool to have you all here. Okay, I'm going to start by saying that when it comes to North Pacific right whales, I am not the expert. And although this guy pictured on the screen, Brian Gisborne, would also tell you he is not the expert. He's exponentially more expert than I am. And I wouldn't know about North Pacific right whales if it wasn't for this guy right here. He's one of the saltiest men on the planet. He spent more time at sea alone than anyone I've ever heard of. Here's a picture of one of his survey courses from a year. So if you guys can probably see my cursor, this is the entrance to the Straits of Juan de Fuca, Vancouver Island here, Cape Flattery, Washington here. So these are all, this is thousands of miles at sea that Brian has done alone. And this is just 1 year. And he is does whale and sea lion survey for Department of Fishery and Oceans in Canada. And he was doing just that, surveying a group of humpbacks when he saw this, which he knew right away was not a humpback, but was a bit confused by until he saw this. So this is a North Pacific right whale. Brian was looking at the second North Pacific right whale seen in British Columbia since 1951. And Brian watched it, saw it was a right whale, and then watched it swim south into Washington. And that sighting is how I personally learned about North Pacific right whales. Until that time, I didn't even know they were a species. But before that, 2013, when 2 North Pacific right whales were seen in British Columbia, 2 different whales, 2 different places. Before that, like I mentioned, the last whale to be seen was in 1951. And that whale looked like this. And that whale was killed by whalers from a whaling station in Cole Harbor, British Columbia. It was killed illegally and unnecessarily. And at the time, right whales, then as now, were protected by international law. And so in a minute, I'm going to take a deep dive into humans' tragic relationship with whales. And of course, just about anywhere where humans have interacted with whales, it's ended in tragedy for the whales. And examining this history is dark and sad. But but it's important to think about the story to let us shine a light on also on whales' resilience. Despite all the horrible things we've done to whales in the oceans, whales are still here, and that's pretty awesome. So I like to keep that in mind as I'm learning about whaling history, and you know, it truly is a tragedy with the North Pacific right whales, but they are still here, and that's pretty impressive. So what is a North Pacific right whale? So North Pacific right whales are a baleen whale. You can see a little bit of the baleen in this picture. You can see the two blowholes there. All baleen whales have two blowholes. Other whales do not. North Pacific right whales are one of 3 species of right whale worldwide. There is in the North Atlantic, there's a species of right whale appropriately called the North Atlantic right whale, and they occur mostly off the coast, Atlantic coast of North America, Canada, and the US. There is a species called the Southern right whale, which lives mostly in the Southern Ocean and goes between like Antarctic waters and South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and then South America, southern part of South America. And then North Pacific right whales live, of course, in the North Pacific. They're one of the most massive animals that's ever evolved on the planet. So the biggest right whales are about a little over 60 feet long, but they weighed 100 tons. And so like the other largest animals to evolve, right? The other big whales, blue whales are about 100 feet long, but also 100 tons. So North Pacific right whales, massive animal. You know, you have this baleen, massive animal eating one of the smallest animals. They're what we call a ram feeder. So that means they swim along at the surface or at depth, basically with their mouths open, swimming along and just straining out whatever they encounter there. That baleen they have, you can see it much better in this picture. They can have up to almost up to 300 plates on each side of their mouth. The longest ones of these, it's a little hard to get the scale in this picture, but the longest ones can be up to 10 feet long. And these are like a lethal killing machine if you look like this, the copepods. These little guys are about the size of the grain of rice, but they occur in such high densities that you can take the world's, you know, some of the smallest animals in the world and turn that into one of the largest animals in the world. And so research has shown that they can occur up to densities of up to 20 million per cubic meter. So that's dense. And right whales, they know, won't even start feeding until they hit a certain density. So they don't even waste their time until you have some really soupy copepody water to swim through. So here's a map of where North Pacific right whales occur. And this map is a little deceptive in that there's actually 2 populations of them. You could just draw a line basically right up the middle of the Pacific. And on the Russian side and Korea and Japan, you have a population that numbers in the low hundreds. Probably no one really knows, but it is a less than a couple hundred probably. And then on our side, off North America, between Baja here and the Bering Sea up here, we think there's about 30 whales in that population. And we know that population spends, I'm going to take it back for a sec. So like the gray whales and other large whales, they spend the summer months in the high latitudes. So for right whales, it's in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. Just like gray whales, right? They you know, you might be seeing off the Oregon coast right now on their way south. They head north and south. But unlike gray whales, we don't know where North Pacific right whales go when they leave the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. So some like very basic natural history knowledge that we have for pretty much every other whale species, we don't have for North Pacific right whales. We don't know where they go to calve and to breed, which is some pretty important stuff to know for a species, especially if you want to protect them. And the reason we don't know is because they're so rare. researchers will go years without sighting a single whale. And what little we do know is from a handful of sightings that have happened in the Southeast Bering Sea. This is their critical habitat in those lines, federally designated critical habitat. And then all those marks on here are different sightings. But we know a lot from whales that when they're up there. And then we infer a lot about North Pacific right whales from the very well studied or comparatively well studied North Atlantic right whales. So for thousands of years, the Pacific Northwest was like a cultural epicenter for indigenous whaling, and that included right whales along with humpback and gray whales, and then a handful of other species. So although the whaling culture from southern Vancouver Island and northwest Washington are more known for it, there's plenty evidence that the first peoples of Oregon actually did whaling as well. And that's been super cool for me to learn about in the last couple of weeks getting ready for this talk. And there's some cool pieces of evidence from a site that was somewhere in Seaside that has these bones, and others. These are just ones I could find pictures of that have butchering marks in the bones, which shows that the folks are definitely making use of the whale. There's no right whale evidence from this particular site, but there are right whales from sites in Washington and Vancouver Island. So it's not a stretch to think that right whales also might have been used on the Oregon coast. And also in the site, they found a bone that had a elk antler harpoon fragment stuck in it. So that shows someone harpooned a whale. The harpoon gets stuck, obviously, in the bone, breaks off. And the DNA from that elk antler is also from the North Coast, so somewhere in the North Oregon coast. So that shows like a pretty local system, which is really, really cool to think about. Here's a picture from this is from Vancouver Island, a humpback whale. There's just this rich, thousands of years of pretty rich history of the first peoples making use of whales and having like a very intimate and close relationship with them. And of course, that tribal legacy is still really tangible in efforts to hunt gray whales still by the macaw and folks on Vancouver Island as well. And I'm, of course, not at all qualified to speak about this stuff other than just like relay some information I've come across. If you are interested in learning more, this book is a really good place to start. Charlotte Cote, excellent book. Check it out if you're interested in learning more about that stuff. But of course, it's not indigenous whaling that has right whales down to 30 whales. It's a legacy of commercial whaling that took place from 1840 all the way until 1967 that left North Pacific right whales decimated. So following 19th century commercial extinction of right whales and sperm whales in the Atlantic, whalers started coming around Cape Horn into the Pacific. And by 1935, we're whaling off in what they called the Northwest Grounds, which was basically from Northern California up into Alaska, including off the Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia coast. And by 1840, this was the state of the North Pacific Ocean and the whaling fleet. So oil, mostly whale oil, is what lit the lights in the cities of the Northeast at the time. It was also used for everything else that oil is used for today, like cooking and lubricants, machinery, and candles, and all that. But by 1840, hundreds of ships were whaling in the North Pacific, spending the fair months in the Northwest Grounds, like I mentioned, and then wintering in Hawaii or sometimes San Francisco until they filled their ship up with whale oil and had a successful cruise and would sail back, usually around Cape Horn, back the way they came, back to the East Coast. With them went the populations of one of the biggest animals ever to live, as I mentioned. So packed below the decks on those boats. Oh, it's not, hold on here, having some So packed below the decks on those boats, and this is the most hardest number for me to get my mind around in the whole thing with North Pacific right whales. It was 20 to 30,000 right whales between 1840 and 1850. So be in that 10-year span, using strictly sail power and these boats sailing out mostly out of the East Coast. There's a handful of French and English boats also that participated. They killed the entire population of North Pacific right whales, basically, right? 20,000 to 30,000 whales were killed in that 10-year span. Pretty crazy to me. And they were considered commercially extinct by the late 19th century, although they still weren't protected. And then at the turn of the 20th century, we saw this second wave of commercial whaling in the North Pacific, using diesel and steam and coal-powered boats that were faster, exploding harpoons, and that put a lot of the whale species that were previously protected strictly by their speed and their tendency to sink after they were killed, put them also in reach. So blue whales and fin whales, but also just had the more whaling pressure in the North Pacific still had them killing North Pacific right whales. So you may recognize the name on this ship, especially folks tuning in from Washington tonight. The Moran, that's the same Moran that the big state park on Orcas Island in the San Juans is named after. Moran was a shipyard in Seattle, but this boat here was built, it eventually ended up in whaling in Alaska, where it participated in killing some of the last few right whales ever to be killed up there. But before that, it was actually built to tow whales from the Oregon coast up to Westport, where there was a shore-based whaling station. So that same company had a pier they rented in Coos Bay, and they would kill whales, store them at the pier, which you can imagine how gruesome and horrible smelling that would be. They'd storm at the pier till they had enough, and then they would tow them up using this boat and one other boat up to Westport, where they'd be processed again for their oil. And at this time, one of the hugest tragedies of historic whaling that is at this time, much of the whale products were just going to pet food and fertilizer, and just pretty devastating to think about what happened to these, where these whales ended up as some of these products. And then here's some pictures of some of the last right whales in Alaska. This fishery was taking place at the time when we had photography, so we have some pictures of them. And this spot here, I'll take it back a sec. We were actually able, when we're making the film, we visited this place here. It's the buildings aren't there anymore, but however, some of the machinery is still there. Give you a little bit of sense of exactly how fat right whales are. And then, although they didn't take any right whales, some of you guys from the Oregon coast may know a touch about this history. It's been new to me to learn about, but there was actually a whaling station briefly for 5 years in Warrenton in the early 60s. And it was set up basically to provide protein to a mink farm that was elsewhere in Oregon. So they just turned these whales into mink oil and mink fur, and then the oil was used for soap. So that was in 61 to 65 in Warrenton. I actually have a family member from Seaside that went there on a field trip to see the place. And then lastly, what I'll say about whaling is right whales were actually protected in 1935. It was one of the first international conventions to protect any species of animal. Fur seals came a little before that, but right whales and gray whales were protected in 35. Gray whales probably would be extinct without that protection, just because they're pretty easy to find. And right whales would potentially be extinct without that protection as well, although a little harder to find. However, starting in the late 40s and going into the 60s, the Soviets had a whaling fleet in the North Pacific that was, although it was illegal, they took close to 800 right whales in the North Pacific in that time span. And that was, again, likely the majority of the recovering population. And so there's been this interesting mystery in the sightings data of right whales in the Pacific that was kind of solved by figuring out this woman named Yulia Ivanchenko that lives in Seattle, was a Russian biologist, lives in Seattle, was able to like figure out that the Soviets were doing that illegal whaling. But you could see in the sightings, just like research sightings, up until about the mid 40s or a little later, the sightings increased. People were starting to see right whales again, and then it just drops off again. And researchers had wondered for a very long time why that was. And then just recently, they've uncovered some of the Soviet data that says that the Soviets took all these whales, not far off our coast, not far off the coast of Alaska as well. If you're interested in any of this stuff, this book is a pretty excellent read as well. Weighty and sad read, but interesting little piece of Northwest history that I learned nothing about until I took this kind of deep dive into learning about North Pacific right whales. So thankfully, North Pacific right whales are no longer whaled commercially or otherwise, but humans are very likely still causing mortality in the population. So we know from Atlantic right whales, which I should mention are also highly endangered, about 400, less than 400 left Atlantic right whales. But we know from that population that entanglement in fishing gear, you can see here, this is like a lobster pot and the line to the surface for that, or on our coast, it would be a Dungeness crab pot. We know that entanglement and then getting hit by a ship is the leading cause of mortality for that population of whales, or that species of whale. And so we assume that for North Pacific right whales, that is also a potential cause of mortality. And you can imagine with a population of 30 whales, that losing one whale is tragic, right? Especially if it's a female, which there are less females in this population than males, or a juvenile. So, there's evidence of some of the North Pacific right whales that have been seen that have entanglement scars. As a matter of fact, that very first one I showed you that Brian Gisborne had seen had a big entanglement scar on its rostrum. So these things are happening. Although we're not whaling them, there are still things in the ocean that can kill these whales. And so now to like the state of research, what we know and are learning about right whales now, and the most of the research is focused, like I mentioned, in the critical habitat in the Southeast Bering Sea. There is a hydrophone right in the middle of those clumps that is named Peggy. I'll show you in a sec. There's a hydrophone that collects a lot of data, or underwater microphone that's collecting a lot of data about North Pacific right whales. And really, on a good year, there is a team underway doing research, or at least trying to find right whales to do research on, but that actually doesn't happen. It certainly doesn't happen every year, and quite the opposite, really. So, but there is a couple people working very hard, and this is Jess Kranz, and I respect this woman so much. The lengths that she goes to get data about North Pacific right whales is pretty astounding. So she's done since I met her a few years ago, she's done a handful of cruises where she's been the only non-Japanese speaking person and the only female on these research cruises, which are usually on this boat right here, which you may recognize as being one of the Japanese whaling boats, which is just another little twist of weirdness around right whale research, that we have to send a NOAA person out on a Japanese whaling boat to do whale research. That it's annoying, to say the least. But the data that Jess collects using hydrophones and these things called sonobuoys is one, great right whale data, but also it models to the International Whaling Commission and to Japan that you can get really good data about whales without killing them, which some of you guys may know about the minke whale research that Japan has historically done. And it's a full aside. But they go out, they send these hydrophone sonobuoys over the side. And then depending on the arrangement they have in the water, if they hear a right whale, they can actually triangulate to where that is and then maneuver the ship to to where that whale is so they can photo ID it, ideally biopsy it. In the past, a couple of times, they've actually got a satellite tag on it. And so they use sound to find the whales, and then once they hear them, they know they're out there, and then they try to find them to get to see them. And this is what they hear when they hear a right whale. So this is a shot called a gunshot call, and then a shot you'll hear in a second called an up call. And hopefully you guys are able to hear that. And so that's what a right whale sounds like. Like I mentioned, there's a hydrophone in this clump of sightings here named Peggy that records more right whales than just about, well, it records more North Pacific right whales than any other hydrophone. And so we were actually able to voyage out to Peggy a couple of years ago, which was very cool. We were all shocked. I don't know why, that it actually just said Peggy on the side, which was pretty funny. We'd heard it referred to as Peggy, didn't know it would be labeled. This is where Peggy is in the Bering Sea. So this is basically how we find out about right whales, is sending Jess out and when she can. And then there's a handful of folks that just stumble across them when they're like Brian Gisborne, who's doing research on other whales. But there is not a super organized effort to learn about how North Pacific right whales are really using their habitat. And so therefore, there's not really a great effort to conserve them using things like the Endangered Species Act and the protections that we can afford them. And all the researchers we talked to agree that if we want to protect them, we got to figure out more about them, including where they go when they leave the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. So this map here, you see the North Pacific, obviously, Bering Sea, and where these lines go through is a place called Unamak Pass, which is the main pass to get into and out of the Bering Sea from the North Pacific. And there's 2 hydrophones in Unamak Pass that have recorded right whales every month of the year. But then, as you can see from these lines, it is actually a pretty major shipping route from the West Coast to Asia and back. And on the order of about 5,000 ship transits happen through Unamak Pass a year. And it's not the tightest space of water, but it is not by any means a large space. And so here is a place where we know we have right whales, and it is not protected by, if you gave it critical habitat designation, you could start looking at things like slowing those ships down if it could be done safely going through, and maybe restricting fishing that happens there while the right whales are there. There's a handful of things you could do that we are currently not doing. But then we know that once they go through Unamak Pass, they're in the North Pacific, and we don't really know much about where they are after that, with the exception of a handful of sightings I'll show you in a sec. I also will mention that almost all the gray whales that are migrating to the Bering Straits up here and back travel through Unamak Pass as well. So if you saw a whale in one of those clear windless days that we had last week on the coast, that gray whale had likely come through Unamak Pass a couple months ago, or who knows how long ago, but sometime this fall. So what is next for North Pacific right whales? What should we do? Well, first, I would argue that we should update and fully fund the recovery plan that NOAA has produced. Matter of fact, they're legally obligated to do that, and have not funded it much other than Jess's research. But we really need to get a handle on the extent of human interactions with North Pacific right whales, or they are they're likely to go extinct anyways because the population is so low. But to me, it would be quite shameful if we let that happen without doing the things that we can do. And this is a thing we can do. We can learn more about them to learn how they're using the North Pacific and how we can mitigate our interactions with them in the North Pacific. But I would argue that the federal government is doing the bare minimum right now to research and conserve right whales. Like I mentioned, we did need to locate the calving grounds and provide critical habitat protection to that area. Critical habitat protection for Unimak Pass seems very important to me. And then another thing we can do is what you guys are doing here right now is learning about North Pacific right whales, and becoming advocates for them. I would imagine that more than a handful of you didn't know about the species North Pacific right whale until reading about this talk or tonight. And the reason that I've become so interested in it and really feel like I just nominated myself to be the voice of them or a voice for them is that so many people, conservationists and whale researchers that I asked about North Pacific right whales didn't know that they existed. This includes like humpback whale researchers that work in the North Pacific and orca folks and folks at NOAA they didn't know that we had right whales here, like I didn't a handful of years ago. And so just learning about them, learning they exist, learning the risks they're facing goes a long way to, as long as you share that knowledge, to protecting these whales. So the connection between the Oregon coast and North Pacific right whales. So here is a map of right whale takes and sightings from, I think it's 1850 until 1970. And so you can see here that on the Oregon coast, there's not much data, right? But bear in mind that when we started, this is obviously not a complete sampling. And two, when this started, most of the population of right whales had already been killed. And so the North Pacific and right whales use of it looked much different when this data was starting to get collected than it did a decade before. And so this guy over here is named Charles Scammon, and a lot of you probably know who that is. He was the whaler that found where gray whales calved, which unfortunately led to the decimation of that population down to a few hundred whales. But in his later days, he recognized that the whale populations were suffering and we needed some conservation. Conservation in his time, of course, looked a lot different than ours, but he also became a pretty well-respected marine mammal biologist. And in his writing about Oregon and right whales, his quote is, "In former years, the right whales were found on the coast of Oregon, occasionally in large numbers." And so that was his take on it. Not everyone agrees that he had a firsthand account of that. And so it may not be that right whales were using the Oregon coast that much, but it's really hard to know, basically. And if you look at, here are sightings this is from 1970 until now, right whale sightings in the Northeast Pacific. And you can see, again, none off the Oregon coast, relatively few off of Washington. You start to get a lot more, obviously, as you get into Alaska. But you have this clump here, one here, that is one maybe showing where these guys are going to calve, like the other populations of right whales. They may go to these warmer, calmer, less orca-filled waters to have their calves, like the gray whales do and like Atlantic right whales do. And so this to me shows that, one, we might have a sense of where their calving ground is, but two, how does a whale get from British Columbia to Southern California without passing the coast of Oregon? So they are traveling past Oregon. Whether or not they're inside the state waters, it would be pretty hard to know, but certainly they are traveling past. And bear in mind that the time they are there is likely in the winter months when you don't have a bunch of boats on the water, when it's hard to sight whales already, and that they are, there's maybe, let's say there's 10 whales migrating with, 20,000 gray whales or whatever that population is. So it's actually going to be really hard to ID a right whale at sea in those months that we think they're maybe using the Oregon, Washington coast and heading down south. And so some other connections to Oregon and right whales, like pretty directly in that, the crab fishery is a potential cause of entanglement and mortality for right whales, as it is for humpback and gray whales, other whales. But cool that Oregon has recognized that and has this process that they've started to develop a plan to reduce that threat to whale entanglements from the crab fishery. I would argue that it probably doesn't go far enough, but I think it's really cool that they're getting buy-in, some buy-in from the industry, it appears, and that they have this and whale entanglement on the radar. And then Oregon indirectly through conservation efforts like the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve, like the sea otter reintroduction that is hopefully taking place, where, you know, there are these efforts that are either large or small or somewhere in between that are just creating resilience in that ocean ecosystem. And a healthier ocean and a more resilient ocean is going to go a long ways to protecting right whales and all these other whales that we care about. So with that, I'll say thank you for listening to my PowerPoint. I'm going to show a couple of clips of from this film we've been working on called, let me see, do a time check here. Yeah, so the film is called Right Over the Edge, and it's 5 years in the making, and we're very close to being done. And it is about the search for North Pacific right whales. Real quickly on this slide here, I will say that with Save the North Pacific Right Whales, we've created the right whale fan club we're calling the Callosity Club. The callosity being the name for the white bumps that right whales have on their heads. Those things right there, they're not actually barnacles, they're just a rough piece of skin. So you can join the Callosity Club on our website, which is northpacificrightwhale.org. There are different member levels and perks. Yeah, so check that out if you want to be a right whale fan and show the world that you care about North Pacific right whales. So I will, this is a picture of us making the film. So remember, the film is about the search for North Pacific right whales, not, it's not a film strictly about North Pacific right whales. You can't just make a film about right whales in the Pacific, because we can't just go offshore and find one to make a film about. You have to go look for them, which is a process all of its own. And of course, just like you saw in the PowerPoint, like to really learn about these whales, you actually have to take a trip through history to learn how we got where we are. And the film is a lot about that as well. So if we have time, I'm gonna show 3 scenes. The first one is our visit to the Cole Harbor Whaling Station, which is in the north end of Vancouver Island. And all the buildings are still there. And there's a couple characters that are hanging around there that were there when it was operable. And you'll see them in the film here. But to me, like that going to Cole Harbor was a super important part of the story, and learning about that last whale that was killed in Canada. And there's just like such good images of it. And it was just connecting with that felt really important. Meeting those people felt really important, and building relationships and friendships with them. Secondly, I'm going to show you a scene featuring this woman named Giselle Martin, who lives on Vancouver Island, and was like my day spent with her, or the film team's day spent with her, was one of my favorite days in the whole filming process. And then lastly, if we have time, I'll show you, it's the start of a 2-week sailing trip we took on the Bering Sea out to Peggy, that hydrophone and buoy, and then into their critical habitat. So I'm going to exit out of this. I'm going to stop share. I'm going to start share again, optimizing for video. And you guys, I don't have control over your volume. And so if it's quiet, you have to turn it up on your computer. And also bear in mind that this is a rough draft of the film, and playing video over Zoom is not ideal. So there may be some audio or some playback issues. I hope not, but keep that in mind. Let's see. Okay, I gotta do this one more time. Okay, here we go.
Why are you in a car?
We're going to Cole Harbor, the site of an old whaling station. And we're going to meet with Joey and Harry. Harry worked at the whaling station. In 1951, there was a North Pacific right whale that was accidentally taken at this whaling station. It was the first North Pacific right whale that we know of that had been seen on the coast in a really long time. So Harry, how many North Pacific right whales have you seen in your life?
One right whale, yeah. I haven't heard of a boat that had seen a right whale that could have identified it since the one that was shot. When he phoned the manager said, shoot it and we'll see what it is. And that's how things were done back then.
So my wings with the bodies in the gut.
They killed it, and what is at least then told is that they didn't realize it was a right whale. They're whalers. If anybody knew a right whale, they're the experts.
Does anyone else come to the museum and ask about North Pacific right whales?
No, nobody else. But I always point out that's the only right whale that ever takes. The right whale was caught off Esteban right there in that group of numbers. Focus in on the numbers, you should see that, and then the number right there is the right whale. And that's an actual map off of that boat.
I love when you look at it on the chart where the right whale is, that there's the...
Well, that's a dirty fingerprint.
Yeah, it means I think you pay a little attention to that whale too.
It's basically an extinct whale.
So what do you think our chances are of finding a right whale?
About nil. Now, how do you like that?
Okay, let's see. Stop share. Thank you. Hey, Kristen, did that play back all right and you guys could hear it?
Yeah, I heard it just fine.
Okay, excellent. All right, let me get the next one up here. Okay. Okay, yeah, this is Giselle here. Let's see.
My Tlo'as name is Tlauk. I'm from the house of Ehozet from Tlaokoyet First Nation, and my colonial and French name is Giselle. We are in an island which has lifted up my spirits for my whole life. And this island is a site where our nation came to come whale hunting. So there are quite a few whale bones. This is part of a skull. I haven't seen a living in the flesh right whale. But when my grandpa says this land is made of the dust of our ancestors. So there's probably the dust of them all around here as well. I don't know what goes through my head if I see a whale, but I know through my heart I get more excited. I get more excited, I just get happy. The last traditional whale hunt that Tlaokoyet First Nation had was, I believe, in 1910, and there's a picture of a whale on the beach right there. To be a whale hunter had to come from a lifetime of training and spiritual training as well, physical training, respect for those whales. Our family had a quota of 10 whales per year. Pretty sure it might be this one that's a right whale, and if not, it's this one.
This is the closest we've gotten to seeing a right whale. All right, here. Well, maybe we'll stop it with those two and save the rest of the time for Q&A. Does that sound good, Kristen?
I think that's great.
Okay, awesome. Do we have any questions in the?
We do. We
chat?
have 4
Awesome.
questions that came through chat. So if you want to start with those.
Yeah. Do it.
By the way, thank you so much for sharing clips from a movie that hasn't been released yet. Really appreciate that. Thank you.
No
so
problem.
much.
Yeah, we are so close. And yeah, well, hopefully all of you guys can just stay in touch. Hopefully we'll get to just host a screening in person sometime in the next year for, somewhere on the coast down there.
Oh, that'd be amazing. So the first question that came through was, is anything known about the entanglement issues with this population?
So the only thing we know is that some of the whales have scarring in the Northeast Pacific population, so the ones off our coast. A handful of them have scarring that's clearly from entanglement. I couldn't tell you what percentage that is, but it is a thing. And then there's been a death on the Soviet side, Russian side, of a entangled whale in fishing gear a couple years ago, and so that is what we know. But it is definitely a possibility for these guys. Yeah.
Great. The next question is, how many North Pacific right whales would exist in a perfect world?
Ooh, that is one that folks argue about, but it's probably somewhere between. It's probably around 20,000, and there's actually like really good and cool and more organized than you'd think data about many of the kills from the 19th century and even just strikes. So even if they hit a whale with a harpoon but didn't get it to the boat, it got away from them or what got dark, whatever it was, there's data on all those things, and it's not comprehensive, but it exists. And so from ecological data about the North Pacific, they can do an estimate. The folks that have done that estimate are really hesitant to tell you what that number is, but it's likely tens of thousands of North Pacific right whales.
So the next question is, you mentioned that one North Pacific right whale was tagged. Do you know what kind of tag was used and how long it stayed on? And if anything was learned?
Yeah, so they have these satellite tags that they've been using for a long time, or they have been using on the southern right whales, and they hook into their blubber. It's apparently painless and not bad for the whale. The 2 North Pacific right whales that have been satellite tagged showed us really good data that they wanted to stay in the Bering Sea the whole time they had their tag, and so they didn't actually travel much. I think the one of them left the critical habitat for a little while and then came back in. Another one just stayed in the critical habitat or something. They didn't travel far, and the ideal would be to tag a whale and then watch it over the course of the fall swim down to San Diego or the Channel Islands or Baja or something, but that hasn't happened. And the handful of sightings that have happened in Southern California in the last few years, those whales have never been able to be re-sighted by researchers, and so those whales have never been able to be satellite tagged.
The next question is, do you know if any of the crabbers in Warrington, Astoria, or Garibaldi have seen North Pacific right whales, or has anyone talked to them about that for identification, specifically researchers for identification and report?
I don't think anyone has talked to them on an individual level, and we would love. This is an effort that seems like real low-hanging fruit to do survey work off the coast, is to just let the folks that are on the water when we think the whales are there know if they see one, let us know. And Jess Krantz has a project that she has started to get that information out to people, but she hasn't talked to everybody yet. What's super cool, it would take me too long to find it, but there was a sighting of, and so I'll finish the part about the crabbers in there. If someone has a connection and would like to link me to folks, I'd be super happy to start talking to people, and we'll have the time in the next year to do that. And it seems very worthwhile. So thanks for that suggestion. And then there was a whale in 2020, right at the beginning of the lockdown, I think, that was sighted off of Vancouver Island from a cargo ship. And the mate, I think he was mate on board, saw the whale, was just like, oh, cool, there's a whale, took a picture of it, and then was like, oh, I actually can't recognize that whale. And they had resources on the bridge of that boat that had him ID it to a North Pacific right whale. And somehow from that, he figured out that it was a whale that you should report when you see. And so that was really cool that like that chain worked, and that this person was excited about seeing the whale and was able to ID it. So those sort of things do work. And that is, that was the only whale seen that year. And so that's like a huge data point that otherwise wouldn't have been there without these handing out these resources to the folks that are on the water.
And the other question that's in the chat is, what are your favorite conservation films that inspire your work?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I watch shamefully few films. I should watch a lot more. But films that I've seen, there's one about the founding of Greenpeace called How to Change the World, I think, that it's not so much a conservation film, it's just like talks about the politics of founding Greenpeace and how it kind of fell apart. But man, the ideals of those guys that set out that really did, like, they made a lot of missteps, and there was a lot of things that, in the 70s, there was a lot of things you did that you wouldn't do today. But the like passion and that they had, and they didn't start out to save whales. They set out to stop, nuclear testing, basically. But when they latched, the images they got led very directly to stopping commercial whaling internationally. And as soon as they were able to bring back images of whales being killed, that really started to save the whale movement, which in a really short time, like, stopped whaling, which is huge. And that is like the end of commercial whaling internationally, which happened in the early 80s. That is like one of the biggest conservation wins that has ever happened on the planet. And this film documents that pretty well. So how to save the world, I think. So I would recommend that. Yeah. Folks also want to know where they can send donations. Oh yeah, you can go to if you go to northpacificrightwhale.org. Kate, if you're still watching, can you put that in the chat? My partner in crime at Save the North Pacific Right Whale is I think watching. Oh, there we go. Or also deepgreenwilderness.com. They both go to fund the work we're doing. But there's donate links at either of those websites, and you can get to one from the other as well. But, yeah. Kevin, I know we're at time, but I was wondering, we still have a lot of people still with us. Would you be open for another couple of minutes of questions if folks have them? Yeah, if we have more. Oh yeah, Kate just got the right one up there. Yeah, if we have more questions, yeah, I got nothing going on. And okay. I just got to say too, it is, it's a wild time right now where I think everyone's really missing the work that they're accustomed to doing, and like to see so many people that are curious about this thing that I clearly care deeply about is really heartwarming. So thank you all for tuning in. And yeah, I could talk for longer than anyone wants to hear about if folks have questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or unmute yourself. Oh, got a question. Are there any job opportunities in this area? Ooh, not so much. Yeah. There are any field research whale positions have been really weird in the last year because of COVID. I think they will start to come back. But they're there's really no one doing right whale research in a funded way except for Jess and a couple of folks at NOAA. So to work directly with right whales, no. To do whale research, yes. As soon as the pandemic, like as soon as people can safely travel and stuff, all that stuff will come back some, I hope. Yeah.
There's some similar question about volunteer opportunities in Oregon.
Yeah, I actually don't know about any volunteer opportunities in Oregon, but I maybe hand that over to you to answer.
Yeah, sure. So as far as I'm aware, there aren't any directly related to the North Pacific right whale. If there's anyone that is in the audience tonight that might have a better idea, please feel free to put that information in the chat. I know that there is a program at Oregon State University, and there are some folks at Hatfield Science Center that could also probably connect you to researchers within the field as well.
And if you are doing work on the coast on whales, you're doing work towards North Pacific right whales, because anything that's taking out these threats to humpbacks or to gray whales that are on the coast is also reduced. Those threats are shared. You know, it's a large whale swimming through the ocean, doing different things, of course, but like the threats of ship strike, entanglement, ocean noise, those are shared by all of those species. And so if you are volunteering counting gray whales or humpbacks, whatever it is, like that work is benefiting all these critters, which is cool to think about.
Is there anyone in the political institutions that you see as an advocate or ally for better conservation efforts for the North Pacific right whale?
Well, we want to work on Maria Cantwell, our senator in Washington here, who doesn't know it yet, but is going to be our strongest advocate for funding the recovery plan, because she is currently in charge of the purse strings for NOAA, while the Democrats stay in power in the Senate. And so there isn't, answer the question, no, not yet. Longer answer is yes, we really want to work on this, especially when we have the film done, and hopefully get like some of her staff to see the film is really part of the plan. If anyone's got any ins to any of your Oregon politicians, locally or federally, we are super stoked to talk and definitely have plenty to chat with them about right whales. Yeah.
Awesome. We have some more questions. Is there a probability that whale 52 is a right whale?
Oh, this is, if I'm not mistaken, this whale that's calling it a frequency that no other whale calls. I've only seen the trailer for that film. I haven't seen the film yet, but it's a film about this whale that's calling it this frequency that isn't recognizable to any whale species that we know of. And so these guys go to find it. I hope I'm getting this right, but I don't think it's a right whale, but that would be really cool if it was. That would be a cool link.
Just to let people know, yes, shout out to the Whale Watching Spoken Here program. It's on pause right now, but definitely get involved with that. We also have the American Cetacean Society Oregon chapter. We have folks still here with us tonight that could also be good connections for you for volunteer work as well. Another question is diminishing krill and copepod populations in the North Pacific. Any evidence that it's hurting right whales? Any evidence of whales losing weight?
There is not a direct evidence of that. However, either like a moving food source or reduced food source and ocean conditions in the North Pacific due to climate change. I mean, other things too, but of course, climate change being the huge driver of that is really bad for North Pacific right whales. Kate just sent me a paper today that she found that says that the North Pacific right whales and actually gray whales are like two of the species in the planet that stand to be most impacted by climate change, just because the ecosystem where their calories are coming from is changing much more rapidly than most of the other ecosystems. And so the Bering Straits especially, but also the Bering Sea. I didn't really cover this, but the years that the critical habitat where the right whales are freezes over, the combination of ice and then the bathymetry of the seafloor there and the depth of the seafloor creates this God, I'm just blanking on the word. But anyways, a layer between the cold water and the warm water that traps all the krill and copepods that makes it like very easy for them to get those calories in those copepods. Those are the years when the Bering Sea and critical habitat freezes over. The years, and it's called a cold pool year. The year that doesn't happen, they have to travel much farther to get that same amount of calories, so expending more calories. And so there isn't direct evidence that they're losing weight. There is evidence that when the years that the ocean is warmer, they travel farther. We think to feed, that's the assumption, but the data points again are pretty few. What's cool is that most of that data is just from hydrophones. So there's a hydrophone array in the Bering Sea, and the right whales occur further north on those hydrophones. You hear right whale songs on the years following a warm winter in the Bering Sea. And so that's all data that they have about how right whales are using the ecosystem without ever even seeing a right whale, which is cool because as explained, it's actually pretty hard to see one. So super cool research that Jess and this woman named Dana Wright, who also works at NOAA, is doing. Pretty interesting stuff.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Kevin again for taking the time out to be with us tonight, and I'm so excited to be able to see the film when it's finished. If you have any questions, please reach out. My contact information is on the screen. I encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and do check out our upcoming programs. We have one on Thursday, the 20th of this month. It is a discussion, a facilitated discussion about the personal meanings around climate change. And then in February, we have an awesome North Coast Ocean Trivia Night. And I encourage you to sign up. Thank you so much. Have a good night.